Pseudo-random number generation in video games, or PRNG for short and often simplified to RNG, is the process with which a game can come up with random numbers that allow for different luck-based events to occur. This can range from enemy patterns, item drops, whether moves will hit in an RPG, and a very large variety of other things. But a computer can't actually come up with truly random numbers. A computer can only do calculations, meaning that an RNG algorithm is basically just a series of operations that comes up with a series of numbers in a way that's seemingly random and hard to control, hence the P for pseudo in PRNG. To someone who understands how the RNG in a game works, this means that an RNG system is only really as random as it is difficult to control the numbers it produces, and since different games can implement RNG in very different ways, that means that the difficulty of RNG manipulations changes from game to game. In this video, I wanted to provide a general overview of RNG manipulations in speedruns, what makes some easier than others, as well as look at a few concrete examples of how manipulations in some games work. Let's dive right in. Let's talk a little bit about how a typical RNG algorithm actually works. First, there's usually an initial RNG seed. The algorithm has to start generating random numbers from somewhere, and this is often the starting point. This number is usually either a fixed known number, or is in turn generated from an external factor like a system clock. If the seed is fixed, then it's obviously always gonna be the same every time, but if it's generated externally, then in order to manipulate it, we need to look at how easy those external factors are to control. In some cases that can be really difficult, like in the case of a seed that gets generated by PC's system clock down to its nanoseconds, while in some cases it's more doable, like in the case of just needing to start the game within a specific frame. Now that a seed exists, let's look at the actual RNG algorithm. It usually takes the seed as an input number, does some math, and produces an output number. This new number is the newly calculated RNG value, which usually replaces the input value for future calculations. The whole process of calculating a new value from the previous value is called an advancement. You can think of this algorithm as a sort of black box, as the details of how a new RNG value is actually calculated are often irrelevant for our purposes. All we really need to know is that if there's a certain input value, the output value will always be the same. The other key detail to understand about this algorithm is when an advancement actually occurs. This varies from game to game. For some games, this happens on every frame the game is running, usually once per frame, but sometimes more. For other games, the RNG stays a little more static, instead only getting advanced upon specific events, such as when performing a specific action like opening a menu, or after the RNG is actually read by something. Speaking of which, whenever the time comes for a game to generate a random event, it will look at the RNG value and decide the outcome of said random event depending on the number it just saw. For example, let's say an enemy has to choose between two possible attack patterns. One way this could be programmed is by looking at the RNG value at that very moment and doing one pattern if this value is even and the other pattern if it's odd. Once again, the details as to how the decision of what random outcome to select vary depending on how they're actually programmed, and there's a wide variety of ways to do this, but it's not actually too relevant for our purposes. So to summarize, generally speaking, an RNG value will get seeded by some initial value, then an algorithm will advance that value in some way to make sure it keeps changing during the course of a playthrough, and when something luck-based needs to happen, it will look at the value of the RNG at that moment in time and take a decision on outcome based on that. That is a general overview of how RNG typically works in video games. There's obviously cases in which implementations will vary a bit, but these general rules apply to a lot of games. One notable aspect about manipulating the RNG is that it often tends to be more doable with older titles, particularly stuff from the 80s or 90s. In an era before the internet, when a lot of games were still programmed in assembly and before many real game engines to speak of, programmers were often left to their own devices to program an entire RNG system from scratch, according primarily to their own creativity. This resulted in a wide variety of implementations, but also a varying degree of quality. Okay, I think that's enough theory. Let's look at a few concrete examples, shall we? I'm going to start by talking about a game that has fairly static RNG and that can be completely manipulated from start to finish. You've probably never heard of this game, but it's called Whirlo, and it's a platformer made by Namco for the Super Nintendo. This game only has a handful of random events during the course of the run, and they are the generation of a puzzle in some catacombs about 10 minutes into the run, the attack patterns of the Anaconda boss about halfway through the run, the location of a key inside of the pirate ship level, the contents of crates in the second to last room in the game, and the layout of the final room in the game, chosen from 16 possible layouts. What makes this game notable is that the RNG only ever advances whenever one of these specific random events reads it. This means that if you start from the same seed, so long as you, for example, solve the Catacombs puzzle on the first try, kill the Anaconda in a consistent amount of cycles, and so on, regardless of how the rest of the game is played, you'll always get the same random outcomes every time, because the RNG is going to get advanced an amount of times that is known in advance. In other words, we just have to worry about the initial seeding and how a handful of specific spots of the game are played, and we have an RNG manipulation in our hands. Let's take a look at how the seeding takes place then. On screen, you're now seeing the RNG value. Once again, if you look at how this value changes during the majority of the game, you'll notice that it doesn't, since this game elects to only advance it when a random event is actively making use of it, only at which point it'll change. But when you're on the title screen, you'll notice that it advances once every frame. It always increments by 1, and since it is located within a single byte of memory, that means that there are 256 possible values it can be, after which it will roll back to 0. Once you start a new game, the RNG stops advancing and it will remain frozen at its last value. That is, until something like the Catacombs puzzle reads the RNG and advances it in the process. This is our seeding process, so with that all in mind, manipulating the initial seed is conceptually very simple, as all you need to do is start a new game within a specific frame, and you can use the music on the title screen as an audio cue for your own button press. It's obviously a tight timing, and recognizing whether you press the button on the right frame can be difficult, but if it is successful, that's pretty much all you need to do, and you can enjoy very favorable outcomes 100% of the time on what's otherwise supposed to be luck-based events. Now, it's not actually super clear-cut which title screen frame provides the fastest RNG throughout the run, but one candidate is the one that you get after winning exactly 75 frames, and if you're somehow interested in more details as to how it was found, I'll leave a link in the description to a document detailing the entire process I followed. Now, Whirlo's ease of manipulation is in great part due to how its RNG stays static for the great majority of the game. But what if the RNG is constantly advanced every frame? Well, there are still ways to manipulate it to an extent. Take for example Pokémon Mystery Dungeon Explorers of Sky for the Nintendo DS. In this game, you get assigned a starter Pokémon through a personality quiz right at the start of the game. The problem is, the questions you get asked are random, and not all question sets allow you to actually get the starter Pokémon you'd want for a run. So being able to manipulate this quiz would be very convenient. Let's look at how the RNG system works. We'll talk more about how the seed gets chosen in a bit, but for now, know that this is something that we do have control over how it's generated. In regards to how the RNG changes, it is generally advanced to every frame, and interestingly enough, for a different amount of times depending on whether you're holding any buttons on the DS or not. It will be advanced once per frame if you're not holding anything, or it will be advanced twice per frame if you're holding at least something, like the B button. With all of this in mind, since what we're trying to manipulate is at the very start of the run, these mechanics do actually make manipulating the quiz doable, and here's why. We can make the number of advancements in any given frame consistent by simply holding a button down at all times. During the setup, we elect to always hold the B button down, which will also automatically clear all the text boxes framed perfectly without needing to mash, which is a great feature by the way. Then, to get the same quiz every time, we just need to start a new game within a specific frame. This will generate the questions for the quiz on a known frame, when we also know that a very specific amount of RNG advancements has been made. This would be frame perfect, but it's actually fairly easy due to the fact that the new game option can be buffered within a 21 frame window while the DS's top screen is fading in, making it possible to start a new game frame perfectly very reliably. Notice how early this A press is made before the screen actually starts fading out. This is the buffering mechanic coming into play, guaranteeing that we start the new game at the same time every time, regardless of when during the 21 frames of fade in we make our A press. So this is enough to allow for a manipulation, provided we can start from a known RNG seed. As far as that goes, this is a value loaded from the save file once you advance past the title screen. Note that when I say save file, I'm not referring to an active playthrough. Even if you go and delete all data about said playthrough, there is still always a save file on the DS cartridge that contains various information such as the RNG seed to restore. The RNG seed is written into the save file depending on the frame you save the game or the frame you delete an active playthrough. So this means it is possible to legitimately write just about any RNG seed by deleting an active playthrough on the perfect frame. Once you have an RNG seed stored in your save file, you can just restart the game, hold the B button down, buffer through the title sequences, buffer the new game press, and you should get the same questions every time. Now you just need to figure out if you can get the Pokémon you want off the questions you're given, and if you can, congrats! You can use the save file for all future runs from now on. Even better actually, just skip all these setup steps and just download one of the pre-made save files that I made. They've been generated with the help of a bot that checked every possible RNG seed and the questions it generated, so the questions you get are not only guaranteed to allow you to get the Pokémon you want, but also the questions with the overall shortest possible text, so you can save a cute few seconds in this master of an RNG heavy, several hours long run. That all being said, while it is possible to manipulate the quiz, the rest of the run generally is not possible. That is because once you start doing actual gameplay and are not stuck in dialogue for 5 minutes, you will naturally go a little faster or slower, and again, the frame that you'd initiate a random event on will determine what outcomes you end up getting. You could in theory wait for a specific frame chosen in advance, but you can really only hit so many frame perfect windows in a row in a real run, and once you miss one, you're basically out of luck since the RNG is now sitting at an unknown value and it's generally difficult to figure out how many advancements you need to let happen to hit the value you want without planning it beforehand. A fully maniped run of Explorers of Sky is pretty much out of the question. However, there's another technique you can sometimes apply in cases like this. If you can reset the RNG to a known value and then initiate a random event from there, you can essentially perform a manipulation in the middle of the run regardless of how you played beforehand. A common way to do this is by saving and resetting the game. This doesn't work in Explorers of Sky because when you save, the current value of the RNG gets stored on the save file and it will be used as the initial seed the next time you boot up the game. However, the two 3DS sequels, Pokémon Mystery Dungeon Gates to Infinity and Pokémon Super Mystery Dungeon, do not work like this. These two games always advance the RNG once per frame and always start from a fixed known seed regardless of what save file you already have present. This makes it possible to save and reset in the middle of a run and initiate random events within a frame window to manipulate the desired outcomes. For example, in Super Mystery Dungeon, you can save and reset in the middle of Chapter 5, wait a few seconds on the file select screen, and select continue within a 12-frame window. After watching the ensuing cutscene, if you perform this correctly, the shop should have an attack looplet, which is a very good item that boosts your attack and saves turns in a bunch of fights. Quite remarkable for an RNG system to have gotten more exploitable in newer titles of a franchise, and games that came out in 2013 and 2015 at that. But let's take a step back here. All of the manipes we've covered so far essentially boil down to hitting a specific frame window during which the RNG is at a desirable value. But sometimes the execution can be a lot more complex while still remaining doable. There's a very interesting case with Kirby's Dream Land 2. Here the RNG is back to staying a little more on the static side, where it won't be periodically and automatically advanced, but rather it will only be advanced when something specific is making a call to it. However, things here aren't as simple as they were with Whirlo, where the amount of things that advanced the RNG was extremely limited and they were generally trivial to control. Here we're dealing with a game where just traversing through a single screen is likely to result in several advancements, because most enemies you're going to encounter will make calls to the RNG to determine their actions. It doesn't end here actually, because on top of that, RNG calls are made to determine the animation of a lot of random particles, such as bubbles when you're swimming, the dust you suck in when inhaling, or the star you spawn when landing on the ground or bonking against a wall. This makes it a little too difficult to run through long sections of the game and still expect to end up with a very specific RNG value. Unless you're somehow able to move through those sections very consistently and never ever make a mistake such as touching a platform you weren't supposed to, which you can't really keep up for long. However, that's not actually necessary, because these random particles can actually be taken advantage of, and the most useful one is the star that spawns once Kirby lands on the ground. The way this star works is it will basically read the RNG and then decide the direction to fly off to, chosen between 8 possible ones. Some runners codify these directions with numbers 1 to 8, like in this image. And as I said, this star will also advance the RNG when making this call. If you think about it, this means two very important things. First, it means that you have a tool to advance the RNG on command, because all you have to do is simply jump and land to spawn the star. But second, and arguably most important, you have a tool to read what the current RNG value is, because with a bit of planning, you can spawn a few stars and understand exactly how close you are to your desired RNG value. Just like every example we've covered today, the RNG sequence here is perfectly linear, meaning that every value that the RNG could possibly contain follows a perfectly linear order, and there's no other factor adding what you could call potential entropy into the equation. Since we know that the star directions directly correlate to the RNG value itself, then we can also deduce that the order of these directions is also perfectly linear. So in theory, this could allow us, in the middle of a run, to advance the RNG to whatever value we want, and then initiate a random event and be able to predict the outcome. And in fact, the speedrun for this game has many instances where this exact thing is possible. Let's take a look at perhaps the most important manip that a runner would want to attempt. This is level 6-4, and early on you will encounter a mid-boss protecting a bag. This bag provides a random chance to find either of the 3 animal friends that serve as rides. You definitely want to find Ku in here, because he's just so much faster than the others and you're going to hopefully be playing many more levels with him. It's obviously very desirable to have a way to guarantee Ku, and here's where a manip comes into play.
First, one detail that I haven't mentioned comes pretty handy here. The game automatically saves once you defeat a boss at the end of a world, and so you can just reset here, which not only saves time from skipping a bunch of animations, but also conveniently resets the RNG to a fixed value. This is also done at the end of World 5, so we will be able to enter World 6 on a clean slate. Now, the title screen and file select screen here do constantly advance the RNG every frame in an attempt to seed it for the playthrough, so it is important that we don't spend too long on these screens. We won't be able to control the exact value we will exit out of these screens with, but we don't actually care too much here, so long as we haven't advanced the RNG too far and we have a rough idea of how many advancements we've made. Then we just have to play World 6 as normal, going through all of 6-1, 6-2, and 6-3. It's important to not make too many mistakes through these levels in order to not cause too many more RNG advancements than usual here. In particular, it is vital to pay extra attention around the sparky enemies, because if this enemy gets going for too long, it will start firing off sparks in a bunch of random directions, and it will cause our RNG value to get absolutely destroyed. Usually the way around this is to just kill these enemies before they get a chance to attack. Once we're in the level selection hub screen, we can start jumping around and looking at the star directions. We're gonna continue jumping until we see a very specific sequence. Going by the nomenclature pictured in this image again, we're looking for 6-6-4. Once the final star spawns, we can enter 6-4 and know with full confidence that the RNG value we have is the one we want. We do have to play one short screen with a few enemies and have to watch out about not causing any extra unnecessary stars to spawn, but once we're through, we can fight the mid-boss, manipulating a good pattern from it in the process, and then open the bag and find Ku. Very nice. This type of manip is very common in this game and can serve many purposes, such as manipulating good patterns off of important bosses, or manipulating rare rewards needed for the 100% run. And while they can certainly be difficult, they are also extremely valuable and help save dozens of seconds throughout the game. This is just scratching the surface in regards to this topic. There's games with broken RNG math that result in guaranteed outcomes in certain scenarios. There's games that actually just make use of a frame counter as a way to provide randomness. Nevertheless, I hope this helps illustrate just how different RNG manipulations can be across games, depending on both how they're designed and how they work under the hood. When looking at a game, if you want to figure out whether an RNG manipulation is viable, it is first important to have a general understanding of how the RNG has been implemented in that game, which usually involves a little bit of looking at memory values and maybe looking at some code. Once you know how the RNG works, you can start thinking about how to control it. However, do note that not every game is going to have RNG that's manipulable. Some games, by design, have RNG whose values are too chaotic and are basically lost causes. Let's look at one final example. I want to briefly talk about a game that does not have RNG manipulations and that I'm very skeptical will ever get one. Cuphead. There are numerous problems with this game. Let's start from the seeding. Cuphead was made with the Unity game engine, and it relies on Unity's RNG system for almost everything. Unity's RNG is in turn seeded from the PC's system clock. Both Windows and macOS, which are the operating systems that Cuphead is officially out on, make it very difficult to freeze the system time to a specific replicable value. So starting from a known seed in the first place is already tricky, but let's assume you were able to do that in some way. Well, it turns out that Cuphead makes RNG calls for so many things. NPC idle animations, dust particles, firing bullets, pretty much every single sound effect. The film grain animation for goodness sake! This makes it extremely difficult for someone to make a consistent amount of RNG advancements. You might be able to carry an RNG manipulation into maybe the first level, and even that is very questionable. But any small variance in gameplay is going to cause a different amount of RNG advancement, giving different RNG outcomes. And once again, once you've made a different amount of RNG advancements, it can be difficult to get back on a predetermined route. We don't have anything nearly as good as the star particle from Kirby's Dream Land 2, and even if we did, the RNG calls this game is making are just too frequent and chaotic to be able to have a grip over them. So basically, as of now, RNG manipulations in Cuphead seem completely out of reach. But you know, maybe it's better off that way. For some games, a little bit of the right type of RNG can actually make the run more fun. When a speedrun doesn't have much RNG, once you have run the game for long enough, it's common for the run to develop into a more flat endeavor where muscle memory takes over and there isn't much active thinking. It is my opinion that if a random element can make the player actively think about directions a little more during the course of a run, it can actually make the run more interesting compared to a lack of RNG. And I think Cuphead is a great example of a game with a lot of fun RNG elements. For example, I think the RNG in the green matchstick fight is pretty fun. Here, the entire part of the level on which you can stand on, these clouds, is literally random. It forces the player to think a lot on the spot and to adjust depending on where the clouds are and what the boss is doing.
And overall, this randomness doesn't end up impacting the time by that much. Things like this are what can help make a run more dynamic, and I'm a big fan of that. On the other hand though, I would be remiss if I didn't say that RNG can also be unfun. From time to time, you can definitely get completely screwed over by the RNG. You can bring some stellar execution to the table, but if the game just gives you bad RNG throughout, even if it doesn't usually impact your time much, a lot of smaller time losses can make for a slow time even without making any mistakes at all.
Some RNG elements are also just straight up unfun. If the RNG doesn't really add any interesting dynamics to the run, if it's just something that makes you save or lose time in a very straightforward manner, thanks for another 6-second time loss for the 5th run in a row rumor, then it's definitely just a negative.
That being said though, ultimately I still prefer having this little bit of bad RNG in Cuphead but make the run more dynamic than to remove it completely. I like Cuphead better this way, personally. Thank you very much for watching. I hope you've enjoyed this video, found it useful, interesting, or anything in between. As a personal note, this video took quite a lot of time to put together, but I'm really glad I've made this and I'm hoping to make more educational videos about various speedrunning topics in the future. They might not be super frequent as of right now, as I'm still figuring out how to even work on projects like this efficiently, and I'm not helping myself by making the videos this long, but I'm sure I'll get it sorted out eventually. Alright, that's all from me. I hope you have a nice day, and I'll see you next time. Take care!